What's up, my children? This is your B-Boy, checking in for episode 4 of the BRESTMAM series. We're going to continue our decoder story today, after we talked about the BRESTMAM's decoder for a bit and identified one of the main points that could be improved. We talked about the two-sided communication that occurs between the float type selector on one hand and the quadrant cycler array on the other. And we determined that every time the clock needs to switch from one flow type to the next, precious time is lost. So today, I want to start looking at possible solutions for closing the ranks. Reduce that communication time to 0. But can it be reduced to 0? The problem we have here is somewhat related to the role that speed of light plays in astronomy. I know, far-fetched comparison, but stick with me. See, here on Earth, the speed of light, for an average Joe like myself, for all practical purposes, is instant. If I switch on the light in a dark room, for example, the room will be lit instantly. But the speed of light itself, it is not instant. While it may seem instant for everyday situations, like a dark room, light actually does take time to get from A to B, and the amount to which that becomes noticeable all depends on the scope. The light of the sun, for example, already takes 8 minutes to reach the Earth, so if, hypothetically, the sun were suddenly gone, we wouldn't find out until 8 minutes later, and on a cosmic scale, the distance between the Earth and the sun is an absolute joke. The closest star to our own solar system, which is Proxima Centauri, is over 4 light years away, which means that light from our sun takes over 4 years to reach that star, and vice versa. And that's the closest star. Now, the similarity with our own shapes issue right here is that it's all a matter of scale. That was the main point of last video. Just like flipping on the light in a room, switching over from one flow type to the next happens in the blink of an eye. And that's why it may seem negligible. But the more you increase the scope, just like with the light, the slower this supposedly instant thing actually becomes. So, how can we shatter that unbreakable ceiling? Well, the answer is we can't make an in-game shapes tick faster than it already is. But luckily, unlike astronomers who cannot increase the speed of light, we have got options to think outside the box. So, back to our shapes issue. The problem is that we lose time in the communication between these two parts of the clock. The float type selector waits until the quadrant cycler array emits a pulse before it acts, and vice versa. So what can we do? Well, even though it remains true that we cannot speed up the time the float type selector takes to switch from one float type to the next, we can try to trigger it early. What about finding a way to let the float type selector trigger before the quadrant cycler array is done with its cycle? If we could do that and time it just right, we could try to make it so that the new cycle starts right after the previous one ends, with tick precision. And that's an excellent idea, in theory, but we have a practical problem. In the previous episode, I gave you an example calculation based on the assumption that a switchover takes 5 ticks. Well, it turns out that that's actually a gross underestimation. It's more like 3 times that. So 15 ticks prior to the end of a cycle, we would need to send a pulse into the flow type selector. But when is that? How do we determine when t minus 15 ticks occurs? Because after all, the length of a cycle isn't fixed. That's the whole point of this clock in the first place. It extracts floating pieces from the target shape, but the amount of floating pieces that we can extract from it depends on the amount of quadrants on each individual layer, which is different for every target shape. And there is more even. Have a look at this. Let's say this is our input shape coming from the hub, and we would want to check for floating pieces of type 1. Now, put on your thinking hat and tell me, how many pieces of flow type 1 are in this shape? Go ahead, give it some brain. In case you said 4, then you are correct. And it's these 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. That's what it is, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. That's all 4 of them. So now, we take a step back again. We're gonna look at the bigger story again. We want our decoder to check one floating piece every tick, right? And for this example shape, there are 4 floating pieces of type 1, meaning that the cycle for flow type 1 lasts 4 ticks. But we previously said that we wanted to try to emit a pulse to the float type selector 15 ticks prior to the end of the cycle, which means that in this case, we would need to emit a pulse to the float type selector 11 ticks before the cycle has even begun. So we hit a dead end, right? Then, what about a different approach? Let's look at this particular shape again and analyze it for a bit. Let's get it on screen, what I prepared here, right? Let's look at this. If we exclusively look at the first 2 layers, how many float pieces are there? Well, we just answered that question. It's 4. It's these 4, right? Then, what about the middle 2 layers? The answer? Also 4. And the top 2? Well, the top 2 layers are identical to the first 2, the bottom 2, so also here the answer is 4. Next, let's look at the bottom 3 layers together. If you want to count for yourself, feel free to pause the video because I'm gonna spoil the answer right now. It's 8. These are the 8 pieces of float type 4 that exist within the shape. Next, float type 5, also here, 8. And finally, how many quad floats can we get out of this shape? Well, the answer is 16. So, what if we could make a variable pulsator? A pulsator that starts counting, and after 4 ticks, it emits a pulse. And then after another 4 ticks, another pulse. And after another 4, another pulse. Then, after 8 ticks, another pulse. After another 8 ticks, another pulse. And then a final pulse, 16 ticks after that. In other words, can I create a machine that starts running, then pulsates on the 5th, 9th, 13th, 21st, 29th, and 45th tick, and then repeat? Because that would solve our problem, wouldn't it? If we created a pulsator device that could do that, and then we hook it up to the float type selector, then all the pieces would fall into place, wouldn't they? Because that would remove the mutual dependency that existed between the float type selector and the quadrant array. It would make the dependency unidirectional, and that would allow us to create seamless loops. This is the first step to solving our problem, but we're not there yet. Let's repeat the same exercise we just did, but with a different shape. This shape right here. Let's analyze this shape and look at flow type 1. For flow type 1, there are 3 potential floats. For flow type 2, there are also 3 potential flows. For flow type 3, there are only 2 fathomable pieces. And then, flow type 4, there are also 3 pieces. How about flow type 5? The answer here is 6, and here they are. There are 6 potential floating pieces hidden in this shape that pertain to flow type 5. And then, finally, flow type 6. You have any ideas? Well, also 6 candidates. So let's make the equation again. For this shape, we'd need our pulsating device to send out a pulse on the 4th, 7th, 9th, 12th, 18th, and 24th tick, and then repeat. Do you see what's going on yet? Why these numbers? Where do they come from? And how can we predict them for any given shape? Well, actually, they're just simple, basic multiplications. The first float type has 3 pieces because the first layer has 1 quadrant on it and the second layer has 3. So we only need to cycle through the quadrants of layer 2. For float type 2, the same thing happens. For float type 3, again. For float type 4, again. And the reason why flow type 5 has 6 candidates is the result of the same multiplication. We multiply each layer by the amount of quadrants on that layer. So layer 2 has 3 quadrants, layer 3 has 1, layer 4 has 2, and therefore 3 times 1 times 2 equals 6. And for flow type 6, again, the same multiplication, only now we take 4 layers into account. 1 times 3 times 1 times 2 still equals 6. And that's how we got the result for the other one too. Let's have another look. Layers 1 and 2, 2 times 2 equals 4. Layers 2 and 3, 2 times 2 equals 4. Layers 3 and 4, ditto. Flow types 4 and 5, 2 times 2 times 2 equals 8. And for the last flow type, 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 equals 16. This realization is the breakthrough. That is how we're going to get it done. This is how we're going to get it done. We need to multiply the amount of quadrants on each layer with one another. And then we simply add each value we obtain to the previous one to calculate when the next pulse should occur. That's it. Now, of course, this is just the theory. The next question is how we can put it into practice. After all, this is a fun factory game where shapes with cute forms run across belts and get painted and stuff. It's a factory game, a conveyor belt game, right? So how can we get these mathematical operations into a game that's focused on crafting and not numbers? Well, that's what we're going to explore next episode. Dear girls and boys, I hope you had fun. I hope you're excited to see what's coming up next. And if you are, in case you're not subscribed, go ahead and do it. You know you want to. And leave a like and a comment while you're at it so this guy can feel good about himself. Hey, I've been Binz, and as always, thank you a bunch for watching. See you soon. Bye.